In the 6th century BC, the Persian king Darius I starts to build a city fit for a king, right in the heart of present-day Iran. It will become the legendary city of Persepolis.
It is a ginormous construction, one of the greatest sites of antiquity.
Darius's power is much contested, so to dominate his vast empire, he designs a series of majestic palaces on a terrace nearly 50 feet above the ground.
Anyone who has ever been, even once, to Persepolis will never forget the sheer magic of the place.
A dream of a veritable Garden of Eden at the heart of the Middle East, the extravagant city soon becomes one of the nerve centers of the empire.
This terrace is just the tip of the iceberg.
Over the centuries, archaeological discoveries will reveal the city's many mysteries.
Palaces on palaces, pleasure gardens. It is an earthly paradise.
How could such a marvel emerge out of the ground? How do the most recent archaeological discoveries reveal its true role? How is an empire like this managed by its successive rulers? And above all, how could centuries of architectural ingenuity be devastated in just a few hours? Persepolis reveals its incredible secrets. In the 6th century BC, the Persian Empire, ruled by the Achaemenid kings, was the largest and richest eastern territory of antiquity. When he became king of the Persians in 521 BC, Darius I inherited a kingdom of several million square miles that stretched from India to the Mediterranean. To dominate this vast empire, Darius seized power by force.
He was a usurper to the throne. There were many, many rebellions and upheavals across the empire. So the first 6 years of Darius's reign is pretty much occupied with putting down these rebellions.
He was victorious, but now he had to consolidate his reign. How was he to unite such a vast empire and make peace between all its many different regions? The king came up with a bold solution. He would mobilize all the forces of his empire in the service of a sole royal project. He embarked upon the most ambitious construction of his time. It would be the largest royal residence ever seen, Persepolis.
The objective was to represent his power and to create a gigantic image of the power of the Persian Empire. Darius was the one under whom the empire grew to its largest. Above all, he reorganized it by laying all its administrative foundations, the foundations of an imperial infrastructure. So this immense political construction was built to last, and indeed it would, for almost 2 centuries.
So how best was he to dominate the region? Along with his architects, Darius envisioned a set of palaces nearly 50 feet high that would impose royal authority over the entire surrounding plain. The first step was to build a terrace on the mountainside, a real technical challenge for the time.
To build such a terrace, faced with huge stone blocks, they had to level the foothills of the mountain, fill in the holes, then cut the stone to make a flat surface of 30 acres. And that was just the first huge project.
And it had an undeniably political role. Darius designed a terrace much larger and much higher than any other ancient site of its time. The king wanted to gather all his people there for great ceremonies. It was nearly 50 feet above ground level, so the architects designed a staircase of the same monumental dimensions.
One of the most conspicuous constructions at Persepolis is this huge staircase, which is doubles on itself. So it goes up on two sides, turns at an angle, and then mounts to the platform of the terrace itself. You know, when you stand at the bottom of this staircase, it's a really impressive superstructure.
Each of the two staircases had no less than 111 steps carved out of huge, massive blocks of stone.
It's a very wide staircase, but with shallow steps that go up. And it's been suggested that this is because animals needed to climb this staircase as well. During the great sort of tribute-bearing festivals. So we can imagine that horses, camels, oxen, goats, sheep were all able to mount this staircase as well. So there's a practical element as well as a very, very theatrical element to this huge staircase.
Visitors then headed to the Gate of All Nations, which beyond its remarkable aesthetics had an important symbolic dimension.
The door was like a boundary between the outer world and the inner world. By passing through it, you were getting closer to the true core of the empire, the court and the great king. In other words, it was a part of the theatrical process of appearing to bring people closer to their monarch. The whole thing was a display of power and royalty.
At a height of over 16 feet, huge stone sculptures, winged bulls and other mythical beasts frame the Gate of All Nations, looking down on all who pass. What role did these sculptures play in Persian culture, and what was the significance of these huge bull figures? These ancient masterpieces can now be admired thousands of miles away in France, in the heart of Paris. The Louvre Museum is one of the only museums in the world to exhibit sculptures like these in such a perfect state of preservation. Sculptures from Assyrian palaces, now part of present-day Iraq, served as inspiration for the construction of Persepolis.
In particular, it's at the access to the terrace of Persepolis, the Gate of All Nations, that we find the same type of winged man bulls called lamassus. They protect the entry of the palace. On their bearded heads, they wear a horn tiara. And we know that in ancient Mesopotamia, the characters or creatures who wore these kinds of horned headdresses represented deities. The more horns there are, the more important the god is.
They had two essential functions. On the one hand, they impressed the visitor and made him aware of the importance of his surroundings. On the other hand, they were considered to be so-called protopaic forces. In other words, they repelled evil forces and kept the interior of the palace clean and pure, and free from any unfavorable and harmful influences.
Once inside the palace complex, visitors entered the heart of royal power, represented by the most majestic of the buildings, the Apadana. Today, only the remains of the ancient palace still stand, a few columns that overlook the archaeological site. But 2,500 years ago, this building dazzled its visitors. It was the tallest and longest palace ever imagined.
It is a ginormous construction. It is of a huge scale, the size of at least 2 football fields.
Truly, in ancient times, we don't know of any other building of this size.
The Apadana is actually the centerpiece of the entire complex. It's one of the most impressive and imposing structures, and the heart of the Achaemenid Empire.
The Apadana Palace can accommodate up to 30,000 guests. This was unheard of at the time. Before they even entered the palace, they were struck by the bas-reliefs of all colors that adorn the stairs of the building, and all the drawings of grand scenes showing the extent of royal power.
The Apadana is covered with incredibly fine carved reliefs. They represent the sheer numbers of all the sons of Persian soldiers. They're to illustrate the power and the many conquests of what was one of the world's most victorious armies. Each regional population is represented by its distinctive costume and headdress. They have different beards. And above all, each brings specialties from their province. They can also offer animals to the king, especially horses, which were highly prized and very useful for the cavalry.
When visitors entered the Apadana, their amazement was complete. The palace was undoubtedly one of the most beautiful architectural expressions of its time.
When you walked into the Apadana from the bright sunlight outside, it must have been quite an overawing experience, because your eye really is taken up to the roof of the Apadana, because that's where the light is concentrated. And that's where you would have seen all the color playing on these pillars. And I think it wouldn't have been dissimilar to walking into a great medieval cathedral, to see the colored light of the stained glass.
At the center of the palace was an immense hall, the largest in all Persepolis, and there the king gave his grandest receptions. How did the Persians manage to erect such a vast edifice? What techniques did they master better than the other great civilizations of the time? The greatest innovation of this palace was its columns.
These are the tallest columns to be erected at that time. By comparison, the columns of the Parthenon in Athens, which are more or less contemporary, were only about 33 feet tall.
Built almost at the same time as the famous Greek temple, the Apadana Palace is twice as high, with columns rising 66 feet in height.
And at the risk of offending my colleagues in classics, I always think that the Apadana makes the Acropolis, the Parthenon in Athens, look like a garden shed.
A forest of columns supports the entire roof of the palace, more than 70 of them in all. And crowning them, a key element, the capitals on which the ceiling of the Apadana rests. In the Louvre Museum's Oriental Antiquities room, Sébastien Gondé shows us capitals identical to those of Persepolis and incredibly well preserved.
You have to imagine this capital at the top of a column more than 65 feet high that supports huge beams and thus the roof of the building. It's interesting from an iconographic point of view because it represents quite well the Achaemenid art, which was a synthesis of the arts of the whole empire. So here at the top, you've got bowls in a Mesopotamian style, present-day Iraq, and then you've got the scrolls, which are quite recognizable as ancient Greek.
At the base of the capital, you have to imagine a support in the shape of a palm tree of Egyptian inspiration. The whole thing rests on very high, fluted columns of Greek inspiration.
The result was creation which enjoyed the competence and the knowledge of each of these people. The capital of the columns of the Apadana is a wonderful example of how these different cultures were incorporated by the Persians.
This architecture played an eminently political role, to represent a multicultural empire and one that was indestructible and eternal. Even the construction methods themselves represent this ideology.
It's a masterpiece in a way that they've managed to fit together a huge platform of stone where you can barely insert a piece of paper into the joins of the stone. It's really quite a remarkable piece of engineering.
Despite the frequent earthquakes in this part of the world, some of these columns were so well built that they've remained standing to this day.
While some of the columns have survived the centuries, one very impressive building on the terrace has completely disappeared. And it was probably, at the time, the most important building. It acted as the empire's vault. We call it the treasury.
There's only the remains of a mud brick wall at knee level exists. That's because it was not made out of cut stone in the way that the great ceremonial buildings were. Most of it was made out of mud brick and wood. We know they had wooden columns on stone foundations, for instance.
If everything has disappeared, how did we manage to discover the precise function of this place? Archaeological excavations carried out at the beginning of the 20th century uncovered some clues that helped us unravel this mystery.
Fragments of a set of alabaster vases of Egyptian origin have been found, as well as fragments of Greek statues and some bronze objects.
All the offerings and gifts given to the king during ceremonies were kept here in this treasury. It was a veritable Ali Baba's cave.
It was the place in which all of the goods of the empire, the silverware, the gold tableware, the jewelry, the marble sculptures, all of these things were stored there as this great repository, really, of the wealth of the empire.
Preserving the empire's finest treasures was not without its risks. This no doubt explains why this veritable stronghold of the empire was located opposite the central staircase of the palatial complex. Protected by the ramparts, and with the mountain behind it, it was far from the main entrance to the site. In total, a dozen buildings were built on this terrace. It was truly a huge construction site. Some of Darius I's constructions remained unfinished at his death and were completed by his successors, Xerxes I and Artaxerxes I, who shared his desire to make Persepolis a symbol of eternal royal power.
We see in history that a king, an emperor, thinks of building a huge palace for himself. Darius, on the contrary, built a huge area for the dynasty, for the future.
This site was intended to be a dynastic space. And in fact, throughout its history, some 200 years of its existence, we see successive Achaemenid kings adding their mark to the site of Persepolis.
Darius I launched the construction of the most impressive building on the terrace, the Apadana, to assert his power. But right next to it stands another great attraction to today's visitors to the site. It might well have been the king's personal residence, known as the Palace of Darius, or the Takara, and much of its original structure still stands today. It was the son of Darius, King Xerxes, who designed the Gate of All Nations to highlight the multicultural aspect of the empire and to mark the entrance to the dynastic area of the site. It was also Xerxes who initiated the construction of a huge hall, the Hall of 100 Columns, which played an important role in dynastic ceremonies. Artaxerxes I, the son of Xerxes, completed its construction. Each of the kings shared the same ambition, to make this palatial site the highest manifestation of power, and each wanted to make his own mark on it. Over the following centuries, the site never stopped evolving, transforming, and expanding.
So I suppose if we were to visit Persepolis in antiquity, we would have actually seen scaffolding and workmen everywhere, always. So it was never actually completed. It was an ongoing project.
It was a kind of eternal construction site, where from the beginning of the Achaemenid Empire to its end, some part of it was constantly being either built, or rebuilt, or repaired.
It was architecture on an epic scale, of which just a few precious remains survive to this day. A dozen columns and a few winged man bulls.
To this very day, Persepolis continues to impress all those who can get to see it. Even in these ruins, which represent only a very small part of what was actually built, the impact sought by the builders and by Darius himself is still palpable.
But in recent years, the site has been revealing some incredible secrets. It would seem its role has long been misunderstood and underestimated. So, what did Persepolis really look like? And what was it really for? Recent archaeological excavations call into question everything previously thought about the ancient site.
It has sometimes been suggested that Persepolis was purely a kind of religious or ritual city, but that's most likely only half the story. Religious ceremonies certainly took place there, but they probably weren't the primary function of the site.
When you visit Persepolis, you see this 30-acre terrace that's very well built, but it's only the tip of the iceberg.
And now that huge iceberg is gradually being revealed. It was while excavating an area northwest of the terrace that archaeologists realized that the royal project extended much further than the terrace itself.
Persepolis is the visible part of a larger land development project that covers all the surroundings of the Great Terrace, probably as far as to the necropolis of Nakshi Rustam, about 3.5 miles away.
It was discovered that Persepolis incorporated Naksh-e-Rustam, a sacred place that contains several royal tombs, those of Darius I, as well as the 3 kings who succeeded him. This necropolis was built at the foot of a mountain located 4 miles from the terrace. Persepolis was actually a very large area, although sparsely occupied.
We found signs of occupation that could have been built up, inhabited. So we undertook some surveys of ceramics found on the surface, which confirmed that there were, indeed, in ancient times, in the Achaemenid period, quite a few inhabited areas.
Understanding the true extent of Persepolis and the fact that it was inhabited year-round gives a different reading of the site's history.
It's not a place exclusively dedicated to the pleasures of the elite, but really something that approaches a city or like an open city landscape.
Italian and Iranian archaeologists have uncovered strong evidence suggesting that Persepolis must have been an ancient city like Babylon. In the excavation area, they discovered the remains of a huge door.
In 2011, we discovered something very interesting. The monument of Tolle Agioi is a monument built entirely in bricks, glazed bricks, exactly as Babylonian architecture. It probably means the monument of Tolle Agioi, which is the replica of the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. I was the luckiest man in the earth.
The Ishtar Gate was one of the most important entrances to the famous Mesopotamian city because it led to the main thoroughfare used for religious processions. We can imagine that this huge gate must also have symbolized the entrance to the city of Persepolis. But even more astonishingly, this gate calls into question the date when construction began on Persepolis itself.
This gate, which made possible the entrance to this paradise, the royal garden, was built before the terrace of Darius. This is a very exceptional discovery.
This monumental gate is said to have actually been built by Cyrus the Great, the first king of the Persians, and the man who founded the Achaemenid Empire.
When we talk about Persepolis today, the first thing we think of is the palaces and the terrace. But there are also a few monuments outside of them. And that greater Persepolis begins at least 50 years before the Great Construction initiated by Darius I.
Why then did Darius I decide to build the terrace of Persepolis on the mountainside and not on the spot where the gate of Tol-e-Ajori had been erected in the plain by his predecessor?
Probably the reason for the choice to shift from the plain to the mountain was a very strong earthquake which destroyed Tol-e-Ajori. The earthquake was something like 8 of Richter scale. Fars is a seismic area. Babylonian architecture in bricks is for non-seismic areas. Darius probably understood this problem and built his terrace on the rock.
2,000 years ago, the city of Persepolis was inhabited for much of the year. So how many people actually lived in the ancient city? What were their occupations, and what did they live on? The answers to these questions can be found thousands of miles away in the United States at the Oriental Institute of Chicago. It was this institute that launched the first archaeological excavations at Persepolis back in the 1930s, when valuable remains were unearthed. These days, the public can view them, and the study of them is still pursued by today's specialists. The philologist Wouter Henkelmann collects clues to how Persepolis was born.
It is actually a royal inscription by King Xerxes, and these inscriptions were made in 3 languages. This actually is an inscription that talks about the duties of the ideal king, in this case, fighting the evil gods.
At first glance, this language is unlike any other we know. Wouter Henkelmann is one of the few people in the world to have deciphered it. It was the language spoken and written in Persepolis. Those archaeologists back in 1930 were the first to find traces of it.
May I open the door for you? And welcome. Follow me. What you see here is cabinets in which we keep the memory of the Persian Empire. These are the tablets excavated in Persepolis, and this is the real treasury for those interested in the cultural, social history of the Achaemenid Empire.
The majority of the tablets are written in Elamite, the language mostly used by the Persepolis administration. Its cuneiform writing is composed of nails and wedge shapes.
In terms of the history of writing, this is a kind of calligraphy almost. And if you look in detail at the tablet, you see how refined the signs are. They are very small, very precise, very regular, but also the tablet has columns. And all of that is very well designed. It is a real beauty, despite its fragmentary state. It's a list of livestock. It's a complicated tablet that calculates the increase and decrease of a livestock herd.
These small pieces of clay have not yet all been deciphered. At Persepolis, there are always more surprises to come.
So last year we made a really beautiful discovery. This is a fragment of a so-called register that talk about rations given to groups of workers, and they are stone cutters and they are working in Persepolis. But when I first read this, I was very excited because I immediately recognized that these are the people that are building Persepolis. And we can calculate that there's at least 7,000 of them, and maybe 10,000 in these 2 years. So this is an enormous number of people that are working on stone, whatever their precise qualification is as stone cutters.
This small tablet alone proves the scale of the project and the incredibly large number of craftsmen who had to live on site to carry it out. How did these tens of thousands of men live in Persepolis? How were they paid?
It's about payments in kind, mainly in barley, but also in beer and wine and fruit. And the people who are the main recipients of these rations are so-called courtage. And it originally means something like domestic servant. It means somebody who is dependent on you. Dependency is very important in the meaning of courtage. They are dependent workers in a large institutional economy. I don't think that they would be free to walk away the next day if they wanted to, but I also think that they could not be sold. So all of that pleads against the technical definition of slavery, which doesn't mean that our lives were necessarily very rosy.
But how do you feed all these people living and working in Persepolis, especially if there are so many of them? 2,500 years ago, Persepolis was in fact a huge agglomeration with clusters of dwellings surrounded by fields, gardens and orchards. Archaeologists have found evidence of a very high level of agricultural production on the plain.
Agricultural produce was stocked in the royal stores and from there redistributed to the workers, or for the various rites that took place in Persepolis or elsewhere in the province. So the whole economy was based on this redistribution of provisions.
The Persians managed to develop a very complete agricultural model that included both cereals and fruits, but also an impressive number of animals.
I took out a box for you, which contains, among all of these treasures, a very special treasure. This really is a little universe in itself. This tells you the story of the build-up over more than 1 year of a herd of sheep and goats, the expectations of the government of the increase, and also the composition of the herd, which tells you a lot about economic history of that time. What it lists is not livestock or grain or wine, but trees. It is fruit trees, 10,000 about in total, that are planted in the direct vicinity of Persepolis. So we're talking about apples and pears and mulberries and plums and yet other fruits that we cannot even identify that are purposely planted in a direct circle around Persepolis.
These resources circulated throughout the empire and even beyond its borders, which remains the case with some of the products consumed all over the world today that originated in Central Asia and were then cultivated in the Persian Empire of the time.
And this is why we still have rhubarb today. And this happens with rhubarb, but also, for instance, with citrus fruit. So the citron, one of the original citrus species, is attested in a Persian governor's garden near Jerusalem. And it's not native, obviously, to ancient Palestine. And it's logical that the Persians, who loved different kinds of fruit trees, were responsible for its spread.
The tablets tell us of the tens of thousands of trees that had been planted, a venture worthy of an ancient megacity.
The plain of Persepolis is a fertile plain crossed by two rivers in the midst of rather arid mountains. If you look at a satellite image of the Persepolis region, you'll see that what dominates is not the desert, nor the dunes, nor the aridity. It's the green.
And the Persians showed incredible ingenuity in taking advantage of the region's diverse water resources, be they rivers, springs, or rainwater.
This is a climate where rainfall is very irregular throughout the year and very concentrated in autumn and winter. So you need to develop irrigation to ensure a water supply to the crops in the spring and summer when the plants are most in need of it. That's what's led to the development of very large irrigation networks on the plain of Persepolis.
Water from the springs located 6 miles north of Persepolis feeds into a network of open-air canals in the form of trenches. The water is thus diverted to the bottom of the terrace, then onto the plain. In winter, or when it rained, water could also be held back and stored in tanks. The canals then released it in spring and summer to irrigate the cultivated fields.
With the aid of geophysical prospecting, a whole network of squarish ditches was found to the west of Persepolis over more than 50 acres. This network was connected to the canals that were used to irrigate all the land west of Persepolis, to drain and irrigate as well.
Our excavations have proved that there was a net of canals for irrigation which work perfectly to discharge the water which comes from the slope of the hill. I can say it's a masterpiece of engineering.
Thanks to this audacious irrigation system, Darius I and his successors, far from confining Persepolis to its terrace, in fact envisaged a real oasis.
Persepolis was very green. It was a kind of Persian garden, actually, that went around the whole of the terrace. And in fact, recent archaeological discoveries there can now be so specific that we know exactly what plants were being grown there, because we've discovered seed remains. There were foreign plants that were being shipped in to Persepolis to grow in the gardens.
We know very well that the royal administration attached great importance to the development of lush gardens and the planting of fruits and other crops from all over the world, even right at the heart of the kingdom.
The conception of Persepolis was linked not just to its Garden of Eden, but to a very specific ideology. The total reshaping of the landscape was a clear expression of the king's power.
The old Persian word for garden is pardashu, which gives us the Greek word paradisos, and therefore gives us the English paradise, the French paradis, and so forth. So they created the sense of a paradise garden.
Paradise is a term which we are used to know connected with religion. Is a heaven where every soul of a good man will go.
Persepolis would therefore have dominated a fertile plain of more than 62 square miles, becoming, through the centuries and all the constructions, one of the great capitals of the empire.
It certainly is a center in its own way. It is certainly the center of a large institutional economy which is centered on Persepolis and which covered the whole and even more of the modern province of Fars.
In addition to Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, it's one of the 4 great cities of residence that would welcome the great king at regular intervals. And that means not only the great king himself, but also all his entourage, the whole court. It's perhaps comparable to a medieval palace that would house the great king in his court and thus become the heart of the empire.
Strategically located at the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, Persepolis lay at the crossroads of the different provinces and people that made it up.
It was certainly a place of communication between the king and the outside world, a place where the king received delegations from all countries, whether they came from the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, Central Asia, Africa, Egypt, Libya. It was, if you like, a center of the globalized world of antiquity, which encompassed 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa.
The Persian Empire, it was the first truly multinational, multicultural empire.
How did the Achaemenid Persian kings manage to connect the great cities and Persepolis to the whole world? The Persians used the knowledge already acquired from the 4 corners of their empire and their existing roads to design an immense road network.
This whole empire was crisscrossed by roads on which the royal administration moved back and forth, where royal officials sent royal messengers from east to west and from north to south by the fastest possible route.
The most famous of the roads ran from Sardis in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, right the way down to Susa in Elam, and then an extension of that road went to Persepolis as well. But what was interesting about them is that the Persian setup is that you could therefore have a rest, have food, you could change your horses, change your transportation, and move on the next day. These kind of way stations enabled the Persians to actually get messages across the empire very, very quickly.
Thus, at that time, traveling the thousands of miles of the empire from east to west took no more than a few weeks. It was an indispensable instrument of control for Darius and his successors.
If the king knows within days or weeks maximally what is going on the Mediterranean coast or in Central Asia or in northwestern India, then he can react with speed to any calamity that might occur, an event, rebellion, a disaster, whatever.
But how do you control such a vast road network? Everyone who traveled in the empire was required to carry a document, much like a passport, that was checked on a regular basis along their route. In Persia, there was no way around being controlled by the authorities. Every traveler's passport would be full of mysterious seals. Seals. They were the imprint of the Persian Empire and its administration, both literally and figuratively. Much like a stamp or a signature, they played an essential role in an empire where all transactions were meticulously controlled.
We have an army of civil servants, bureaucrats who are recording the day-to-day activities of what's going on in Persepolis. So it's like any kind of great civic institution, really, that the Persians were running, a very hierarchical, bureaucratic organization where every detail was recorded. And you know, I think that Darius the Great himself was one of the greatest bureaucrats of history.
We're back in the United States. At the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the specialist Erin Daly is trying to understand just what those thousands of seals there on the Persepolis tablets represented, and how they served to exercise royal authority. In search of clues, she gathers or reconstructs thousands of these seals by drawing them.
It's sort of a puzzle where sometimes quite insignificant fragments can really transform that impression into a critical data point for the archives.
A figure close to the king on one seal, an animal on another. Following these royal footprints leads to many insights into daily life in Persepolis.
And it can aid in identifying who is associated with whatever transaction is happening on the tablet. It can tell us a whole lot about what elites wanted, right? Or what they were identifying with, what styles they were interested in terms of representing themselves, right? Within this imperial apparatus.
Angèle hopes to be one of the few people in the world to whom the famous ancient city will reveal more of its secrets. Two and a half thousand years after the founding of Persepolis, its history remains shrouded in mystery, especially when it comes to the last days of the city. Its architectural and technical advances seem to have come to an end 200 years after the first stones of the terrace were laid by Darius I.
In fact, building activity at Persepolis stopped around the beginning of the 4th century BC. It's not clear why, but some of the buildings and reliefs are left unfinished.
These unfinished projects marked the fall of the Persian Empire. In the 4th century BC, Persepolis was one of the most splendid jewels of the empire. It had one weakness, though, its vulnerability to attack. Strategically located in the heart of the empire, it was thought to be invincible. The Persian kings didn't deem it necessary to endow it with a system of powerful fortifications. So, such a widespread city was without a coherent system of defenses.
You should imagine that fortification wall not as a massive thing, but as a kind of casemate system that contains corridors and little rooms and also staircases, because it probably had more than one story. And it was a defense wall, but it was also used, as usual, for storage and for all kinds of auxiliary purposes, so for instance administration.
And in the 4th century BC, in the space of just a few hours, a single man and his army was enough to bring down an ancient megacity. Alexander the Great, the man who sealed the fate of Persepolis. He was the heir to the Kingdom of Macedonia, with one of the most powerful armies in the world. By the time he arrived at the city gates in 330 BC, he'd already conquered the western half of the Persian Empire.
Persepolis for Alexander was a very important site to take because he wanted to see himself as the legitimate heir through conquest, of course, of the Persian Empire. He needed the dynastic site of Persepolis more than any other ancient Persian site.
Legend tells us that he made a victorious entry into the city.
First, the city was was given to the soldiers of the army to be destroyed, to be sacked.
All we know today is that the terrace wasn't destroyed immediately. Alexander is said to have lived there with his troops for a few months before continuing his expedition to the eastern end of the empire. But just as Alexander the Great was setting out on further conquests, Persepolis was destroyed by a terrible fire. An event shrouded in mystery.
We know that there was a great fire. We have archaeological proof of that, and that it occurred during Alexander's time at the palace. Was this fire caused deliberately as a kind of revenge, or was it a coincidence? On this point, the ancient sources don't all agree.
And what we get in the Greek and the Latin stories about Alexander of Macedon is this kind of whitewashed heroism surrounding him. I think that the reality of Alexander was far different. I think he's one of the great thugs of history, one of the great vandals of history.
The burning of Persepolis has been interpreted in various ways. One hypothesis is that it was a clear signal to the Persians that the empire had been defeated once and for all, and a message to the last resistance fighters to surrender and give up the fight.
The consequences of the fire at Persepolis are clear. Alexander the Great has gone down in history as the great destroyer, the exterminator of the Persian Empire.
When the great ancient city of Persepolis perished, it was the very symbol of royalty that fell. Persepolis. There still remain precious relics and traces of their life that the Persians left behind them.
Without a doubt, Persepolis is one of the most evocative ruins from antiquity. It is an overawing sight when you go there and you walk through the remains.
But above all, Persepolis represents a unique heritage, one of the largest ancient sites to be classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
It is an essential passage of human history that we are reminded of here. And anyone who has visited Persepolis at least once in their life can never forget the magic of the place.
Nowadays, Persepolis is, for Iranians, the highest representation of the national pride of Persian culture.
Just as Persepolis was a marvel of its own time, so today visitors from all over the world stand in awe of one of the most beautiful cities of antiquity.